Okay, let's go one more video here discussing setup. And so we're still set up here looking at um, our sequence. And we left off kind of talking about targeting. But now what we want to do is come over here to dusk flats and look at a few things. Now, I'm going to show you something under settings that we're not going to change, but we want to take a quick look. So coming back here under settings, under the flat settings, there is a setting here for where the sun is at the start of the night. Now, autopilot is set up. In the evening, the telescope will be on the west side of the pier, pointed back a little bit to the east in order to do flats. And then the idea of CCD autopilot is then in the morning it would switch and point to the telescope on the east side of the pier pointed west, and so it would do the flats on the two sides. We can force the pointing here, and what's set up here is to force the telescope in the evening to do flats on the opposite side of the pier that it wants to. If I want to automate it so it goes where it wants to go, I would hit this auto switch. But that's the one thing we can come into flat settings to do, is hit that switch if we want to do flats on both sides of the pier in the evening rather than setting it up to do dawn flats. Dawn flats have been a little inconsistent for us. But let's now go back to setup. Let's go to session. And now we're going to go to dusk flats. And I can turn on a dusk flat here. And this is going to be for the V filter. I'm bin 2x2, which is kind of our standard now. And I'm going to take 7 frames. And I'm going to update that. So I'm going to come in, and now I have a target, 25,000 counts is what I want to have my average across my frame. The big advantage of that is every flat is to this level, and it will automatically adjust the exposure to match this. So that's a very useful tool for us. It turns out our flats come out a lot better doing this. The challenge then, well, what the software will do is it will start taking flats, and it will only save them once it reaches this target level. And then I can sequence here. I can do an R filter doing the same thing. I could turn on the I filter, hitting update. And I could do these at different levels if I wanted. But the important thing about filters is to make sure we sequence them for a given night in the order of sensitivity. So V is the least sensitive, and so I want to start with it. R is more sensitive, and generally I is more sensitive after that. So I want to sequence them in order of sensitivity for my flat fields here. And so let's turn those back off so I don't leave them on for somebody that doesn't expect them to be on. And then let's look at dark and bias frames. Here I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to turn on so many darks, in this case, bias frames. So there's no filter involved here. This will be ignored, but I'm going to do any number I want here. This will be done between the flats and the object frames. Although if you got your chip cooled down early, you could actually run the zeros and darks even before you did the flats. So the order is not necessarily strict right now on this, but I would want to make sure that I'm doing my zeros. And probably this is a little bit low in count. Maybe you want to go to 16, 17, or biases are pretty quick. And then if I come down here to the darks, I want to match this exposure to my object frames for the night if possible. And the file name will include the exposure level here, so you can actually have it in the header. And so I would set those up. And I could either, if I do this now, I could do update, and then I could say take dark frames now if I was connected to the CCD. And I could just run them. As long as the chip is cold, you can run those pretty much at any point. And so what I would do on a given night is I would set up my flats to start as soon as it's dark enough to do them. Between the end of when it can do the very last flat and the first object frame, it will do my darks and biases. Then I would go through whatever sequence I wanted to set up of my targets. And then I could actually do some darks and biases in the morning the same way between the last image frame and the first flat field. And then after I get done with those, I would set up the sequence to maybe take flats on the other side of the pier. Would be a complete night. We don't do that very often, but it is actually an option for us if we want. So that would be how we would set up an entire sequence for a given night. Paying attention to things like in here with options of, okay, here I'm turning the tracking off after dawn flats. I can set the sequence here under options to make sure that I keep the telescope safe either while it's waiting to do the next set or after it's done with everything. So the last thing that should always do then is send the telescope to park and turn off the tracking, and then when we come in the morning, we can easily put the telescope away. Once we get all our sequencing done here and I have my sessions entirely set up, I'm going to hit run. The software will go through the process of looking at that and telling me what's right and what might be wrong, and then give me the option of starting or going back and fixing something. But then I would go back, fix it, start it, and off it would go running. So that is how we're going to sequence an entire night and how we would set that up.